When heaven closed its mouth and the voice of God hid among the clouds, there was a man on earth who, among ashes and wounds, never ceased to worship. His name was Job, and his faith shook the heavens. The golden light of dawn wraps the hills of Uz. The wind caresses the fields full of life, and the shepherd's song blends with the bleating of thousands of sheep. In the midst of this blessed land walks a man whose fame has spread throughout the East. His name is Job, a man of integrity, who feared God and turned away from evil, a loving father, a faithful husband, a generous servant. Prosperity surrounded him, but arrogance never touched his heart. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, great herds, faithful servants, and an unblemished reputation. But what truly set Job apart was his devotion. Every time his children held a feast, day after day, house after house, Job would rise early. He would take a spotless lamb, offer it on the altar, and pray with a broken heart. Perhaps my children have sinned in their hearts. Perhaps they have cursed God unknowingly. Job didn't pray out of fear of losing. He prayed out of fear of displeasing the Most High. The scene was perfect. Everything breathed peace, harmony, blessing. But while the earth rejoiced, heaven watched. High above, where the sons of God gathered, a shadow appeared. His stride was proud, his eyes probing. It was Satan, the accuser, and God asked him, "Where have you come from?" "From roaming the earth and walking upon it," he answered coldly. Then the Creator spoke a name that shook the realm of darkness. "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on earth." Silence. And suddenly, the question that would change history. "Does Job fear you for nothing?" Satan challenged. "Touch him. Take away everything he has, and see if he does not curse you to your face." And God allowed the trial, not because he doubted Job, but because he trusted. The decree was sealed in heaven, but on earth everything remained the same. Job rose as always, prayed as always, loved as always. But that day, unbeknownst to him, would be his darkest. No lightning, no warnings, only a sky, silent. The invisible battle had begun, and now the heart of the viewer is confronted as well. Can a man remain faithful when he has lost everything? There was a man in the land of Uz whose name echoed with respect and awe, Job. His reputation didn't come from gold or conquests, but from something much rarer and more valuable, integrity. Job was blameless and upright, a man who feared God and shunned evil. His life wasn't just blessed, it was exemplary. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. His home was a beacon of joy, unity, and reverence. On his land grazed 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and a multitude of servants who worked under his just leadership. In all the East, there was no man greater than he. But what truly made Job a giant was not his wealth, it was his heart. His children would hold feasts in their homes, one after another, in a cycle of brotherhood that delighted their father. But after each round of celebrations, Job would rise early. He would offer burnt offerings for each of his children. 10 offerings, 10 intercessions, in case in their joy any had sinned in their hearts. "Perhaps my children have sinned," cursing God in their thoughts, Job would whisper, as the smoke of the sacrifice rose toward heaven. It wasn't fear, it was reverence, a heart not afraid of losing the material, but of offending the eternal. That was his constant routine. Worship not only in abundance, but in spiritual vigilance. He was a man who loved God more than his blessings. His faith did not depend on what he had, but on whom he belonged to. But while the earth was filled with harmony, heaven was preparing for a moment that would change history. One day, the sons of God presented themselves before the Lord. Angels, heavenly ministers, entered before the majesty with reverence, and among them appeared one who no longer revered, one whose fall had filled the heavens with darkness and the earth with deception, Satan. And God spoke to him directly. "Where have you come from?" the adversary answered with disdain. "From roaming the earth and walking upon it." Then the Creator spoke a name that would shake the heavens and provoke hell. "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and shuns evil." The divine declaration wasn't just praise. It was a revelation. Job was not a casual worshipper. He was a living testimony that even in a fallen world, a man could walk with integrity. But the enemy did not give up. Does Job fear God for nothing? Haven't you placed a hedge around him, his household, and all he owns? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his livestock has increased throughout the land. But stretch out your hand, touch everything he has, and see if he doesn't curse you to your face. The challenge was launched, not against Job, but against the essence of faith. Is it possible to love God without receiving anything in return? Can a heart remain faithful when everything is lost and God trusted? Everything he has is in your hands. Just do not lay a finger on him. And Satan departed. On earth, heaven remained silent. There was no lightning, no warning rain. Job awoke as on any other day, walked among his flocks, supervised his servants, prayed, offered burnt offerings, as always. Nothing in his world had changed yet, but heaven had already spoken, and hell had already moved. What neither Job nor his children knew was that their faith was being placed on an eternal scale, not before the eyes of men, but before God himself and his angels. Job was the most upright of all men, and because of that, he would be tested, not because he had failed, not because he deserved punishment, but because his faith was real, and God knew he would endure. This is how the story begins of a man whose life was perfect, until heaven fell silent and hell unleashed its fury. But even when pain draws near, when loss invades, when friends abandon and the body breaks down, Job will teach the world that true faith doesn't need explanations. It only needs God. It was a morning like any other in Job's house. The sun rose over the hills of Uz, and the fields still breathed the peace of a blessed land. The servants worked in the stables, the herds grazed in the valleys, and in the distance the laughter of Job's children filled the air. Once again they had gathered to celebrate, united as always. But in the unseen, something was stirring. In heaven, God's silence did not mean absence, but testing, and on earth shadows began to advance. Suddenly, a messenger arrived running, his face covered in dust and his breath short. His eyes showed more than urgency, they showed horror. "Master Job, the Sabaeans attacked the oxen and the donkeys. They killed your servants with the sword. Only I escaped to bring you the news." Before Job could answer, another messenger arrived, even more shaken. "Fire of God fell from heaven. It consumed the sheep and the shepherds with them. Only I escaped." His words hadn't even ended, and another man appeared in the distance, staggering, soaked in sweat. "The Chaldeans! They formed 3 raiding parties, attacked your camels, killed the servants. Only I escaped to tell you." Job didn't understand. His lips remained shut, but his eyes looked to heaven. Why? Why now? Then the 4th messenger arrived. His legs were trembling, his voice was a broken whisper, and his words were like a knife that pierced the soul of the most upright man in the East. "Your children were eating and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, and suddenly a great wind came from the desert, struck the 4 corners of the house, and the house collapsed on them, and they all died. Only I escaped." Time stood still. Job's world crumbled. No more servants, no more animals, no more wealth, and worst of all, no more children. 10 lives buried in an instant. 10 names torn from a father's heart. The air was thick with dust. The echo of the servants' cries mingled with the stunned silence of the empty fields. Job tore his robe, fell to his knees on the ground, shaved his head as a symbol of mourning. But what he did next would shake the heavens. Job worshipped, yes, he worshipped, from the dust, from the wound, from the abyss of pain. With a trembling voice and a soul in pieces, Job spoke words that would be written for eternity. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Not a single blasphemy came from his lips, not one complaint against God, only worship. The earth fell silent, so did heaven, but hell trembled. Because the one who had been accused worshipped, the one who had lost everything did not curse, the one who was in mourning still loved. The hours passed, night fell, the lamps in the house were out, dust still hung in the air, and in Job's heart only one certainty remained: God had not spoken, but he still believed. Most of the world would never know what had happened that day. No one would understand how a single day could destroy a life and reveal a faith. That day was no accident, it was decree. That day was not punishment, it was test. And Job, though wounded, had overcome. The land was still in mourning, the ashes of the sacrifices mixed with those of grief. The voices that once sang in Job's house were now muted whispers from servants who didn't know how to comfort the man who had lost everything. And even so, Job did not sin. Satan was not satisfied. His accusation still stood. Once again, the sons of God presented themselves before the Lord, and once again, so did he, the adversary. And the Most High, with the same firmness, asked again, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered as before, "From roaming the earth and walking on it." Then God again spoke of the man whose faith had shaken the heavens. "Have you considered my servant Job? He still maintains his integrity, even though you incited me against him to ruin him without cause." But Satan's cunning did not yield. "Skin for skin, everything a man has he will give for his life. But now stretch out your hand and strike his bone and his flesh, and you will see if he does not curse you to your face." And God once again allowed it. "He is in your hands, but spare his life." The day dawned with a strange silence. Job rose as usual, but his body trembled. At first, it was a mild itch, then burning. Spots began to appear on his skin, then sores, then open ulcers filled with pus, covering every inch of his flesh. There was no doctor, no relief, no balm or ointment. The pain was constant and brutal. Flies landed on the wounds. The sun scorched his broken skin. The nights were cold and endless. Job sat on a heap of ashes, no longer in his house, but outside the city, like the impure. He took a piece of broken pottery and used it to scrape his flesh because the pain was unbearable. The most upright man in the East had now become the most despised. Then came the voice he least expected. It wasn't from an enemy, it was from his wife. The woman who had shared the days of prosperity with him now could no longer bear the ruin. Her voice had no tenderness, only anger. Her face showed no compassion, only revulsion, and her words struck directly at the heart. "Are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die." A brutal sentence, an invitation to surrender, a temptation dressed in despair. But Job did not give in. With a weak but firm voice, he replied, "You speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we accept only good from God and not also adversity?" It wasn't a theological statement, it was a confession of faithfulness. Job didn't understand what was happening. He didn't know he was being watched. He had no explanation, but he had a conviction. God was still worthy of trust. And in all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Dust covered him. His body was an open wound. His breath a groan, but his soul remained steadfast. Outside, people murmured, "What must Job have done to deserve this?" His name, once a symbol of honor, was now a symbol of judgment. And yet, Job did not justify himself. Day after day, night after night, the pain continued. There was no cure, no words, no rest. Heaven remained silent. That was the deepest wound of all. Not the flesh, not the loss, but the silence of the one he loved most. Where was God? Why was he silent? Why didn't he answer? But even in the midst of that abyss, Job did not curse, because his faith was not built on answers, but on relationship. The physical pain had reached its peak. His body was unrecognizable. His soul was weary. And yet in the ashes, among ruin and pus, with a trembling voice and a bleeding heart, Job remained faithful. He had no idea what was coming. He didn't know that heaven looked upon him with pride. He didn't know that hell had been humiliated by his perseverance. But that ignorance didn't stop him from worshipping. The darkest corners of human existence, where logic breaks, where prayers seem to bounce off the heavens, Job's faith burned like a faint flame, but unquenchable. That was the most intimate test, not losing things, not losing people, but losing control and still trusting. That was the faith that defeated the darkness. The dust still hung in the air, the sores were not healing, the heavens remained shut, and Job, sunken into the abyss of pain, seemed forgotten by everyone, except for 3 men who, upon hearing what had happened, decided to travel long distances to comfort their friend. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, wise men, respected elders, well-versed in the traditions and paths of the patriarchs, began their journey with one purpose: to stand by Job in his misery, to comfort him in his pain, to offer him words of encouragement as he faced what no man had ever endured before. When they arrived and lifted their eyes from afar, they could not recognize him. That upright, prosperous and steady man had become a disfigured shadow, sitting on a heap of ashes, covered in wounds, with cracked skin and a lost gaze, as if life had abandoned him without goodbye. Then they tore their robes, threw dust on their heads and sat beside him for 7 days and 7 nights, without saying a single word, because they saw that his pain was too great to be touched by a human voice. That shared silence wasn't emptiness. It was reverence. It was the acknowledgement that there are sorrows that can't be explained, wounds that allow no speeches, griefs that can only be met with presence. But on the 8th day, when the sun rose again over Uz and the desert breeze had not yet brought comfort, Job opened his lips, not to blaspheme against God, but to curse the day of his birth, expressing with broken words the abyss that consumed him, wishing he had never seen the light, wishing the day had been erased from heaven's calendar, wishing the doors of the womb had never opened for him. His cry was not against God, it was against his existence. Why is life given to the troubled and days to the bitter in soul, who long for death, but it does not come, who dig for it more than for hidden treasure? Job wasn't asking for an explanation. He was begging for relief. He wasn't demanding justice. He was pleading for rest. He wasn't abandoning his faith. He was simply struggling to breathe. But instead of comfort, he found judgment. The first to speak was Eliphaz the Temanite, the oldest of the group, whose tone was calm but filled with assumptions. He reminded Job that, according to tradition, those who sow wickedness reap affliction. He implied that no innocent person perishes, that the experience of the wise shows that suffering never comes without a cause. And though his words were well structured, they carried poison masked as piety. Job, if you're suffering this much, it's because you did something wrong. Then spoke Bildad the Shuhite, who was more direct, almost cruel. If your children died, he said without a tremble in his voice, it was because they sinned. And God, who does not pervert justice, gave them what they deserved. But if you are truly righteous, then seek God, and perhaps he will restore you. With coldness, he defended tradition, placing law above lament, logic above compassion. Then came Zophar the Naamathite, the most impetuous, the harshest of them all, who stood with words as sharp as stones, declaring that Job wasn't just guilty, but deserved even greater punishment, that his suffering was small compared to his hidden sin, and that only if he truly humbled himself, perhaps God would have mercy. With each speech, Job listened with a broken heart, not just because of their content, but because those who had come to comfort now became accusers, judges seated atop the ruins of his life, hurling arguments like arrows at an already wounded body. And then, Job replied, not with anger, but with pain. "Miserable comforters are you all," he exclaimed. "Can I not pour out my soul without being judged? Do I not have the right to mourn what is happening to me? Where is the compassion? Where is the empathy?" Job defended his integrity without arrogance, and in doing so became a mirror for so many who suffer and find no compassion in those who should offer it. He cried out not for a defense before men, but for an audience with God, because only he knew his heart, only he could testify that Job was not perfect, but he was faithful. And through tears, Job uttered a phrase that would echo through the centuries. A declaration that was not an answer, but a living hope. "I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he shall stand upon the earth, and after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God." There was no explanation, no voice from heaven, no change in his circumstances, but there was a certainty. Job believed that not everything would end in ashes. That even if friends failed, and even if his body disintegrated, still he would see God with his own eyes. The days continued their slow march over the ruins of Uz, and while Job's body remained covered in sores, his soul was now under attack by words as sharp as the pain itself. The silence that had once been sacred had broken into a chain of speeches that tried to explain everything, to fit suffering into ancient formulas, to reduce God's mystery to human logic. But Job's heart, though torn, was not willing to accept unjust judgment, not even from his friends. Eliphaz spoke again, appealing to dreams and visions, speaking in a mystical tone, but without compassion. He claimed that no mortal is righteous before God, that not even the angels are pure in his eyes, and therefore Job should not be surprised by his calamity. He advised him to humble himself, to return to God and accept correction, for God wounds, but also heals. Yet between his lines hid a persistent accusation. "You must have done something. No one suffers for nothing." Bildad insisted on the infallible justice of God. He said the Almighty does not pervert what is right, that if Job's children had died, it was because they deserved judgment, and that if Job turned to the Omnipotent, perhaps his righteousness would be restored. But his words did not bring comfort, only weight on an already broken soul. Zophar was the harshest. He spoke with authority, but without empathy. He accused Job of talking too much, of justifying himself without cause. He declared that Job was hiding sin, that his punishment was light compared to his guilt, and that only if he cleaned his hands would God show him mercy. And Job listened over and over again, day after day. He didn't defend himself out of pride, but out of desperation. He wasn't trying to prove his innocence before men, but to understand why God, whom he loved with all his being, had thrown him into an abyss without explanation. Then Job spoke, not with rage, but with the deep cry of a soul honest before its creator. "Surely you are the people, and wisdom will die with you." He said with irony, not to mock, but to point out the arrogance of those who spoke as if they understood all the ways of God. Job did not deny the greatness of the Almighty, did not ignore his power, but dared to ask, sincerely, what many fear to voice: "Why have you made me your target, Lord? Why do you hide your face and count me as your enemy? What is man that you examine him constantly, test him every moment?" There was no blasphemy in his words, only longing, no rebellion, only anguish. because Job's heart didn't want to understand the world, it wanted to understand God. In his speeches, he defended his integrity, remembered his compassion for the poor, his justice with his servants, his faithfulness at home, his constant reverence, and in doing so, he expressed not arrogance, but sorrow. If I have sinned, show me. But if I have not, why this affliction? His friends kept accusing, clinging to old formulas. The wicked suffer, the righteous prosper. But Job challenged them with reality. The wicked often prosper, their houses are secure, their children grow up in peace. And I, who prayed every morning, who interceded for my children, who never took advantage of widows or withheld bread from the hungry, am destroyed without cause. Then a ray of hope broke through the chaos. In one of his deepest speeches, Job raised his voice and declared with a faith that defied silence, logic, pain, even death, I know that my Redeemer lives, and that at the last he will stand upon the dust. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God. I myself shall see him with my own eyes. I and not another. That cry wasn't an answer. It was a declaration, an anchor thrown into the future. Job didn't know how, didn't know when, but he knew whom he trusted. His Redeemer lived. Despite his skin falling off, despite his body covered in pus, despite the abandonment, the silence, the misunderstanding, despite the words that failed to heal, despite it all. And while men spoke from their limited theology, Job, even in confusion, drew near to a truth only brokenness can reveal. That true faith is not about having answers, but about relationship, and that there are moments when it's not about being right, but about remaining. Job didn't win the debate. His friends didn't change their minds, but heaven was listening. And man's judgment was soon to be replaced by a voice not from earth, but from the whirlwind. For countless days, Job had been the target of human speeches, filled with theological formulas, rigid arguments, and soulless explanations, offered by those who, though they meant to comfort, only wounded with cold words and misdirected judgments, while the true comfort remained in a mysterious silence, not out of indifference but for a deeper purpose not yet revealed. And in this atmosphere of growing tension, when arguments could no longer fill the void and reasoning could not heal the sores, a new voice rose, unexpectedly, that of a young man, Elihu, who had remained silent until then, not out of fear or passivity, but out of respect for the elders, waiting patiently for the right time to speak, not from tradition, but from the burning conviction within him. Elihu, with a fiery gaze and words flowing like a released torrent, spoke to both Job and his friends with a mixture of passion and reverent fear, making it clear that his goal was not to condemn as the others had, but to exalt the justice of God and to declare that even in the deepest suffering, the Creator can speak, whether through dreams, visions, or pain itself, not as punishment, but as a means to rescue the soul from the pit and redirect the heart toward eternity. For God, he insisted, never remains silent without purpose, nor does he wound without a redemptive intention. And it was just as Elihu spoke of the greatness of the Most High, of the thunder of his voice and the mystery of his ways, that something began to shift in the air. Something beyond rhetoric, beyond human knowledge, something that words could no longer contain. For the very atmosphere seemed to bow before the presence of the Holy One. Clouds began to gather on the horizon like a heavenly army preparing to descend. The winds grew with a rising force that roared over the hills. Lightning split the skies like flaming swords, and the trees, once still, began to bend beneath the weight of a glory drawing near. And then, amid the crashing elements, within the whirlwind that spun like a throne of fire and wind, the voice was heard. It was not a common voice. It was not an echo of the heart. It was the voice of God himself. A voice that came not to explain, but to reveal. a voice that did not descend to justify what had happened, but to expose the smallness of human understanding before the immensity of the one who upholds the foundations of the universe. Who is this that darkens counsel with words without knowledge? And thundered the Eternal, and with that single phrase, all the previous conversation was reduced to dust, every human speech silenced, and Job, the broken but upright man, covered his face, for he realized he had spoken too much, without understanding. God did not begin with justice. He did not mention Job's suffering. He did not answer any of his questions. Instead, he led him on a journey of awe through the wonders of creation, the mysteries of the universe, the paths of constellations, the boundaries of the sea, the rain that falls without human hand, the birth of mountain animals, the roar of lions, and the majestic flight of the hawk, as if to say, "Look at what I have made, and tell me if you can comprehend even a small part of what I hold together with my word. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Or who stretched a measuring line across it?" Each question sought no answer, only surrender. For before the greatness of the Creator God, the complaints of the human heart become humble sighs, not because pain doesn't matter, but because in the presence of the one who sees and knows all, even the deepest suffering finds its place within a greater plan, a plan that, though incomprehensible at the moment, is guided by eternal hands that never lose control. Job, who had longed to speak face to face with God, who had pleaded for a hearing like an accused before the judge, now stood in his presence and understood that the judge was also Father. The Creator was also Redeemer, and his silence had not been absence, but waiting. And with a broken soul now filled with light, Job responded not with accusations or demands, but with worship. "Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." He needed no more explanations. Seeing God was enough, because more than answers, Job had received revelation, and in that revelation, his pain did not vanish, but it was transformed. He was no longer a broken man seeking justice, but a surrendered servant who, even in ashes, had seen the glory of the invisible. After the storm, when the voice had fallen silent and the whirlwind had passed, a different silence reigned over the ruined land of Uz, no longer the silence of abandonment or judgment, but the peace that follows revelation, the deep and sacred quiet that rests in the heart of someone who has seen God face to face and has come to understand that even amid unanswered questions, there remains a truth that changes everything. God is still good, even when life is not. God is still just, even when pain says otherwise. And God is still present, even when he hides behind clouds for a time. Job had received no explanations, not about the loss of his children, nor the destruction of his wealth, nor the disease that consumed his flesh, but he had received something infinitely more precious, the glorious vision of the eternal, that intimate and awesome experience that crushes logic and humbles pride, yet rebuilds the soul and plants a faith no longer dependent on circumstances, but on relationship, a faith that no longer asks for signs, because it has been sealed by the very presence of God. And then, when Job humbled himself before the Almighty and confessed his ignorance with trembling yet sincere lips, the same God, now not from the whirlwind but from his throne of justice, turned to Job's friends, those who, in trying to explain suffering, had misrepresented the divine character, had spoken of God without knowledge, and had placed even more weight on the shoulders of a man already crushed by trial. God rebuked Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar with words sharp as a sword. "My anger burns against you, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has." And with this declaration, heaven restored Job's honor before men, making clear that integrity is not having all the answers, but remaining faithful even without any. and that a contrite heart that surrenders, not rebels, is more precious than all human theology. God's judgment did not fall as immediate punishment, but came with mercy, a mercy that required a concrete action. The three friends were to bring 7 bulls and 7 rams and present them before Job, so that he would intercede for them. Yes, that man covered in scars, the one who had been accused, questioned, judged, would now be the priest who stood between them and divine judgment, interceding for those who had not understood him, praying for those who had wounded him with words, forgiving those who had failed to be present when he needed them most. And Job prayed, not out of resentment, not out of superiority, but from a compassion born of brokenness, a grace only known by those who have been held by God's hand in the dark. And when Job prayed for his friends, heaven moved, not by magic, not by merit, but because true restoration begins when a wounded heart chooses forgiveness over revenge, when what has been broken offers itself as a bridge of redemption for those who broke it. Then Scripture says, the Lord restored Job's fortunes, and not only restored them, but gave him twice as much as before. Where there had been loss, now there was multiplication. Where there had been mourning, now life sprang up. The herds returned, but greater in number. The fields blossomed again, but with greater abundance. The servants filled the house again, but with more honor. And in time God gave him children once more, 7 sons and 3 daughters. But this time his daughters received a rare place in those days, an inheritance among their brothers, a gesture of justice, honor and love that showed how much Job's heart had changed, not because of pain, but because of the glory he had seen through it. And the names of his daughters became living poetry, Jemima meaning dove, Keziah evoking the sweetness of perfume, and Keren Happuch meaning jar of coal, a symbol of beauty and grace. They weren't just names, they were testimonies that bitterness had not won, that hope could still bloom after loss. Job lived 140 years after all this, and saw his children and his children's children to the 4th generation. As if God himself were saying, not everything ended in ashes. There is still life, there is still promise. And when his time was complete, he died old and full of days, but more than full of days, full of glory. Because true glory is not in never suffering. True glory is in meeting God in the midst of suffering, in worshiping when all is gone, in remaining faithful when heaven is silent, and in the end, discovering that heaven was never far. When the dust finally settled over the ashes of Uz and the echo of unanswered questions faded into the horizon of time, what remained was not a story of loss, nor even a story of suffering, but a story of revelation. The story of a man who, having lost everything, chose to keep trusting, not because he understood, not because he had any guarantee of restoration, but because his soul had been shaped by a truth greater than circumstance, that the God he worshipped was worthy, not because of what he gave, but because of who he was. Job is not remembered simply because he suffered, nor because he stoically endured the deepest afflictions a man can face. Job is remembered because in the midst of absolute darkness, when there was no voice, no sign, no human comfort, he kept worshipping. In the silence of God, in the seeming abandonment, in the open wound that bled day after day with no explanation, Job did not renounce his faith. He transformed it. He moved from a faith based on what he knew to one based on whom he knew, from tradition to intimacy, from hearing to seeing. And that vision, that encounter with the eternal, was enough to restore his soul, even before his body was healed, even before his fortune was returned, even before his children were given again by God. Because the greatest miracle in his story was not the double portion. It was the transformation of his spirit, the brokenness that became worship, the wound that became an altar, the ashes that became glory. The secret of Job was not in his strength, But in his surrender, it wasn't his willpower that sustained him. It was his humility. It wasn't his knowledge that saved him. It was his reverence. And that reverence, God exalted, not because Job was perfect, but because he was honest, because he dared to ask without blaspheming, because he dared to cry without cursing, because he dared to wait with no visible promise. Because even when everything seemed lost, Job never stopped believing that behind the silence, there was a God who saw, who counted every tear, who heard every sigh, and who, in his time, would speak. Job's story does not offer easy answers to the mystery of human pain. It does not give formulas or quick solutions. It does not promise that all who suffer will be restored in the same way. But it offers one eternal truth, that pain is not the end, that God's silence is not absence, that trial does not cancel purpose, and that heaven, even when it seems silent, is always moving, even in the darkest night of the soul. And that's why Job, the upright man of the East, becomes a mirror for all who today walk through storms with no explanation, losses with no sense, illnesses that defy reason, betrayals that break the heart, silences that hurt more than 1,000 words. To all of them, Job whispers from the eternal pages of the divine story, "You are not alone. I've been there too. I screamed to the sky. I tore my clothes, but in the end, I saw him. In the end, he spoke. In the end, it was worth it." And that is the climax of this story. Not that Job was restored, but that he was transformed. Because after seeing everything burn, after enduring every blow, after being accused, misunderstood, and abandoned, Job didn't just witness God's faithfulness. He became a living testimony of it. Through the centuries, his story has been read, sung, preached, and wept. It has been a light for those walking in shadows. It has been a refuge for those who find no answers. It has been a beacon for those facing storms. And today, it remains an invitation to trust, not in what we feel or see or understand, but in the one who is beyond all understanding. An invitation to keep the faith even when heaven is silent. An invitation to declare, as he once declared, with wounded flesh sitting in ashes, "The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." And later, when the soul can no longer carry the weight of mystery, and the heart cries out for one truth to hold on to repeat his eternal words, not from the mind, but from a spirit touched by God, "I know that my Redeemer lives." Yes, he lives. Even if he's silent for now, even if he hasn't healed yet, even if he hasn't explained yet, he lives. And one day, just like with Job, he will rise over the dust of our ruins and show us it was not in vain, that every tear was counted, that every wound will be restored, and that every silence was part of an eternal plan. And may you too one day say, with a soul full of scars but eyes opened by faith, "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you."